The stage into Cutbank Crossing ran late that day, held up by mud on the grade below the pass, and by the time it rattled down the last stretch of road, the light had gone long and yellow over the Wyoming grass. Sadie Larkin rode the final miles with her hands folded on the carpet bag in her lap, watching the country open out through the window, reading it the way other women might read a letter. Good grass, she thought. Water somewhere close by the green in the low draws. A country a person could work, if it would have her. She was 29 years old, and she had been looked at and found wanting, in enough rooms to know exactly how it would go. She had grown up horseback in the Flint Hills of Kansas, working her father's cattle from the time she could sit a saddle until the fever took him in her 17th year, and the bank took the ground, and the aunt in town who took her in had no use for anything she knew. She had felt it at church socials in Kansas, standing along the wall while prettier girls were asked to dance. She had felt it from her own aunt, who had told her plainly that a plain girl with no money had best learn to be useful, because useful was all she would ever get to be. She had felt it so many times that the feeling had worn smooth, like a stone carried in a pocket for years, and it did not cut her any more. It only sat there, familiar and heavy, while the stage slowed and the driver called out the name of the town. She stepped down into the street of Cutbank Crossing with her one bag and her mended brown dress, and the town took her measure in the time it takes to draw a breath. 2 women outside the mercantile went quiet, and a tall rancher standing by the hitching rail, hat in his hands like a man at a funeral, looked at her face and let his own fall before he could stop it. She saw it happen. She had answered his notice with a plain letter and no photograph, and she watched Garrett Vance understand, right there in the open street, that the woman he had been picturing for 6 weeks was not the woman who had come. He was a big man, sun-cracked and going grey early, handsome in the worn-down way of men who work outdoors and grieve indoors. He recovered himself, crossed the street, and took her bag, and his voice was civil when he said her name and told her his. But civility is a thin blanket, and Sadie had slept under thin blankets all her life. She knew the cold when she felt it. The ride out to Rimrock Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and for the first hour neither of them spoke. The wagon creaked, and somewhere off north a hawk kept pace with them like it had nothing better to do. It was Garrett who finally broke, because guilt will make even a quiet man talk. He said the notice had asked for a steady woman for a hard place. He said it as if reminding himself. She looked straight ahead at the road and answered him. She said steady was what he would get. She said she did not sew fancy and she did not sing, and if he had wanted a picture to set on the mantel he ought to have said so in the paper and saved them both the fare. Then she was quiet again, and let him sit with that, and to his credit he did not argue it. He only flicked the reins and looked at the mountains, and something in the set of his jaw told her the trouble was not entirely her face. There was a grave behind that jaw somewhere. She had seen that look too. Rimrock came into view at sundown, a good solid house and a scatter of barns and corrals under a long red Rimrock ledge that gave the place its name. And before she saw any of it clearly, before she could pick out the bunkhouse from the spring house, she heard the cattle. Any woman raised around stock knows the difference between cattle that are settled and cattle that are not. What came off those pens was not the low, easy sound of a herd at evening. It was a churn. 400 head, near enough, moving and bawling and pushing at the rails, restless the way water is restless before it boils. A young hand sat on the top rail watching them, and when the wagon rolled in he looked at Sadie, and then he grinned a little sideways grin and looked away, and she filed that grin where she filed all such things. His name, she would learn, was Levi Sutton, and he was 21 and he knew everything, the way boys of 21 generally do. The foreman came out to meet the wagon, and he was a different make of man altogether. Grey-bearded, thick through the shoulders, with eyes that had spent 40 years reading weather and stock and men. Amos Teague helped her down like she was somebody, and there was an apology in the way he did it, and she understood then that it was Amos who had talked Garrett into placing the notice at all. He said supper was on and the room off the kitchen was made up, and he said it kindly. But Sadie stood a moment in the dusk before she went in listening. The herd rolled and muttered in the pens like distant thunder that had gotten lost and settled in for the night. Half-broke stock, mountain-gathered, sold on and driven hard by the sound of them. Nobody had ever given them a reason to stand still. She knew something about that. The storm came on the 3rd night. It had been building all day, the air gone thick and copper-smelling, a blue-black wall swallowing the mountains west of the ranch. The cattle felt it long before the men did. By supper, they were milling. By full dark, they were bawling steady, and Garrett had every hand he owned in the saddle, riding slow circles around the big pens, trying to hold a lid on a pot that meant to boil over. Sadie stood on the porch and watched the lightning walk closer. Nobody had asked her to do anything in 3 days but cook and keep to herself, and she had done both, and had watched everything, the way she always watched. She had seen how the hands work the cattle, all push and holler, all pressure. She had seen how the herd hated it. The thunder that finally broke the herd was not even the loudest of the night. It cracked somewhere up on the Rimrock, and in the same breath a rattlesnake spooked out of the wet grass near the fence line, and a big brindle steer went up the rails like the devil had bit him, and then the whole dark mass of them was moving. 400 head hit the north wire in a wave. Posts leaned. The fence sang like a struck string. Levi spurred in yelling and swinging his rope, and a wall of cattle turned at him, and his horse went sideways, nearly down, and Amos was shouting for everyone to give ground before somebody was killed. Garrett sat his gelding in the rain with his rope in his hand, and knew, with the cold clarity that comes to a man at such moments, that he was about to lose the herd, the fences, the season, and maybe a rider, and there was not one thing he could do about it. That was when he saw her. Sadie came off the porch walking, not running, walking, bareheaded in the rain, through the narrow man gate by the loading chute, straight in among 400 head of half-wild cattle on the boil. Garrett shouted at her. She did not appear to hear him. Amos grabbed his arm before he could spur in after her, and the old man's grip was iron, and he said one word. "Wait." She went in low and easy, and she began to make a sound. It was not singing quite. It was low and level and endless, a sound like water over stones, like wind that means no harm. And she moved through the churn of them with her hands loose at her sides, never square at any animal, always angling, always giving them somewhere to go. The men watched a lane open around her. They watched the brindle steer, the one that had started it all, swing his big head at her with the whites of his eyes showing, and they watched her turn one shoulder and drop her voice lower still, and they watched the white go out of his eye like a lamp trimmed down. It took most of an hour. Nobody who stood at that fence ever agreed afterward on how she did it, because there was nothing to see. She only walked and made that low sound, and everywhere she walked the boil went off the herd, the way a pot comes off when it is moved from the fire. The wave of them slowed. The bawling fell away to muttering, and the muttering to silence, and by the time the storm's tail dragged east off the Rimrock, 400 head of cattle stood quiet in the rain around a plain woman in a soaked brown dress, and the only sound in the world was the water dripping off the rails. Amos took his hat off. He did not seem to notice he had done it. Levi Sutton sat his trembling horse with his mouth open and nothing at all coming out of it, which those who knew him would have called a miracle in its own right. And Garrett Vance looked at the woman standing in the middle of his herd and felt something move in his chest that he had kept nailed down for 3 years, and it frightened him worse than the stampede had. Here is the part of the story that is hard to tell. You would think, wouldn't you, that it ended there, that a man who watched a woman do what no rider on his payroll could do would take her hand and count himself blessed. If this story is finding its way into your heart, stay with it, because what that man did next is a thing some of you will recognize, and the answer to it is coming down the road. Garrett had buried a wife named Eleanor 3 years before, under the cottonwood east of the house. She had been beautiful, genuinely beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made the town forgive Rimrock its good fortune, and she had died of a fever in the 3rd winter of their marriage, and Garrett had lived ever since inside the twin walls of his grief and his pride. All evening after the storm he sat with his coffee going cold, listening to the hands in the bunkhouse telling and retelling what they had seen, and instead of gratitude, what rose up in him was shame. Shame that had nothing to do with Sadie and everything to do with him, though he could not have told the difference that night. He thought of the town seeing him with a plain wife after a beautiful one. He thought of Eleanor's grave under the cottonwood. He thought, in the small, mean way that pride thinks, that if he let himself owe this woman, he would owe her everything, and he did not have it to pay. He knocked on the door of the room off the kitchen while her dress was still drying by the stove. He did not look at her while he said it. He said she had done a fine thing, and he would pay her for her trouble and her time, and he said the arrangement would not do. He said it was not anything she had done. He said the morning stage left at 8, and he had already sent word to hold her a seat. Sadie stood with her back straight and heard him out. There are women who would have wept, and women who would have argued, and women who would have thrown the coffee pot, and not one of them would have been wrong. Sadie only looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her face was not hurt, or not only hurt, it was recognition. She had been sent away from things all her life, and she knew the sound of a door closing better than she knew any hymn. She said one thing to him. She said, "Those cattle out there did not care what my face looked like." Then she thanked him for the room and closed the door soft, and in the morning she was on the stage at 8 with her carpet bag on her knees, bound north for the railhead, and the cars east from there, back toward Kansas, and whatever Kansas still held for her, and Garrett Vance stood in front of the depot and watched it pull away north, telling himself he had done a sensible thing. The dust settled, and the town went about its mourning, and out at Rimrock 400 head of cattle walked to the north fence, every last one of them, and stood facing the road. The first day, Garrett called it weather. The herd was off, anybody could see that. They grazed a little and quit. They came to the trough and stood over the water and did not drink, or drank a swallow and lifted their heads and faced north, ears working, as if they were listening for something under the wind. He told Amos it was the storm still in them. Amos said nothing, which was Amos's way of disagreeing. The second day, no honest man could have called it weather. The cattle went off feed. Not some of them, all of them, in the eerie unanimous way of a herd that has made up its single mind. Hay went into the feed bunks and stood there untouched while 400 head drifted, slow and steady as a tide, to the north fence and leaned on it and bawled toward the road. It was not the boil of the storm. It was worse in its way, a low, grieving monotone that carried into the house with the windows shut, that got into a man's sleep. Levi and the hands pushed them off the wire, and the herd let itself be pushed, mild as sheep, and then drifted right back, the way water finds its level. A steer would stand at that north gate with his neck stretched over it, bawling down the empty road, until it raised the hair on a man's arms. The third morning was the morning of the fall market at Cutbank Crossing, the one sale that made or broke a rancher's year, and Garrett walked out at dawn to find the north fence flat on the ground for 30 yards, and the pens standing empty in the grey light. Every gate was still latched. The herd had simply leaned on that fence through the early dark, patient as the tide, until it went down, and then walked out over it into the night. The tracks told the story plainer than words. No scatter, no run. 400 head had left the ranch in a column, like an army with somewhere to be, and every track pointed north up the stage road. Levi Sutton was gone too, his bunk unslept in, and his horse missing from the string, the road she had left on. Amos came and stood beside him in the wrecked fence line and looked at the tracks for a long time, and then the old foreman said what he had been holding behind his teeth for 2 days. He was not a man who enjoyed being right, which is a rarer quality than it should be. He said, "Boss, I have handled stock for 40 years, and I have known maybe 3 human beings in that time who had what that woman has, and not one of them to her degree." He said, "Those cattle were mountain stock, spooked on, sold on, driven on, and nothing in their lives ever gave them one reason to trust a living soul until she walked into that pen in the rain." He said, "They have not gone wild, boss. They know exactly where they are going. They are going where she went." And then Amos looked at Garrett with 40 years of level grey patience and said the thing that could not be taken back. He said, "You sent off the only thing on this ranch those cattle ever believed in. What did you figure they would do?" Garrett stood in the flattened wire with the market 3 hours away, and his entire livelihood walking north up a public road, and he had no answer at all. It is worth saying, before the road, what had happened in town the evening before, because a man's reckoning rarely comes from one direction only. Garrett had driven in at dusk to see the cattle buyer about the morning's sale, and the buyer's office had been full, as it always was on market eve, and presiding over it, as she presided over most things in Cutbank Crossing, was Della Rennick, the buyer's wife. Della was a sharp-eyed woman who kept the ledger of the town standing the way her husband kept the ledger of its cattle, and she missed nothing, and forgave slightly less. She had remarked to the room generally, and to Garrett particularly, that word was the Rimrock stock had gone strange. Off-feed, she had heard. Bawling half the night, she had heard, loud enough that the Kellerman place 2 miles off could not sleep. She had said, with her eyebrows doing the better part of the work, that it was a curious thing for a herd to fall apart in 2 days flat, and she wondered, aloud and sweetly, what could have gotten into the Vance cattle, or gotten out of them. And then, because small towns keep no secrets, she had mentioned the woman. The plain one, off the stage, gone home again inside the week. Della had said, in the tone of a woman laying a card face up, that it seemed a hard place lately for anything to stay put at Rimrock. The room had not laughed, quite. It had done the thing rooms do that is worse than laughing. Garrett had settled his business with the buyer, the year's beef steers promised for morning delivery, his name and his credit standing on it, and he had driven home in the dark with Della Rennick's voice riding along beside him the whole way, and beneath it Amos's, and beneath that another voice, lower and steadier than either, saying, "Those cattle out there did not care what my face looked like." He had not slept. He had sat at the kitchen table most of the night with the lamp turned down. Sometime past midnight the bawling out at the far pens had stopped, and he had taken the silence for a mercy and been grateful for it, and he would taste that gratitude bitter for years. Somewhere in the smallest hours he had stopped arguing with all of it, because there comes an hour in a night like that when a man runs clean out of ways to be wrong. He thought of Eleanor, and found, when he held the thought up honestly, that she would have been ashamed of him, not of Sadie. Eleanor had never once in her life valued a person by their hide. That had been his failing, laid over her memory like a borrowed coat, and the coat did not fit her, and never had. He had decided at the window with the sky going grey that after the market was settled he would ride north, find where the stage had taken her, and say his piece, whatever came of it. Then he had walked out at sun-up and found the fence down and the pens empty, and understood that the herd had come to the same decision 2 days before he had, and had not waited on his pride. He took the stage road north at a long trot with the sun coming up over the grass, and he made himself ready for anything. Scattered stock strung through 10 miles of coolies, losses he could not carry, his name gone to nothing in that buyer's office by 10. He rehearsed every disaster a rancher knows how to rehearse, which is all of them. He was not ready for what was on the other side of Miller's Rise. He heard it before he saw it, not bawling, walking. The sound of a great many animals walking without hurry, and under it, faint and low, a sound like water over stones. He crested the rise and pulled up so sharply the gelding sat back on its haunches. The road ran straight north off the rise for better than a mile, and the whole mile was cattle, 400 head, strung out down the public stage road in a column, redbacks and brindlebacks steaming in the morning sun, calves trotting at their mother's flanks, the old brindle steer up near the front like a sergeant. They were not being driven. There was no rider, no rope, no dog. They were following, and far up at the head of them, small in the distance, walked a woman on foot with a carpet bag in one hand, her brown dress grey with dust, her stride unhurried. The stage had carried her only as far as 3 Mile Station that first morning, where the road north crossed Alkali Creek, and there the line had ended, for the storm had taken out the culvert, and no coach would run north until it was mended. She had waited 2 days in the station house while the agent promised tomorrow, and before light on the third morning she had shouldered her bag and started walking for the next town herself, done with waiting on other people's roads, and the first of the cattle had come over the hill behind her before the sun was fully up. The market crowd bound south for Cutbank Crossing had pulled their wagons and buggies clean off into the grass to let the column pass, and they stood beside their teams in a long scattered line of witnesses, hats in hands, children up on wagon seats, nobody saying a word. Della Rennick's buggy was among them, stopped dead on her early drive up the stage road to fetch her sister in for the market, and Della Rennick stood in it with her gloved hand at her mouth, watching 400 head of cattle follow a plain woman down a public road, and for the first time in the recorded history of Cutbank Crossing, she had nothing to say. Levi Sutton, who had held the night watch on the pens, sat his horse in the ditch grass where he had sat for an hour, not trying to turn one single cow. When Garrett came down off the rise past him, Levi looked up at his boss with an expression washed clean of every sideways grin he had ever grinned. He said the wire had gone down so quiet under their leaning that the last of the herd was over it before he rightly understood what he was watching, and after that it was follow them, or lose them in the dark, so he had followed. He said he had tried to haze the leaders back at first light, and the herd had flowed around him like he was a rock in a creek, and he had decided he was not going to be the man who got between them and her. He said, and his voice cracked a little on it, "Boss, they walked all night." Garrett rode the length of his herd at a walk. It took a long time. Every animal he passed was an animal he had raised or bought or doctored or cursed. Every one of them was money he owed and hay he had cut, and winters he had fought through, and every one of them had chosen. There is no argument a man can make against 400 head of cattle. They cannot be shamed and they cannot be talked around, and they do not care what the town says. They had witnessed what he had witnessed, there in the storm, and they had rendered the verdict he had refused to render, and they had walked all night to deliver it. Sadie heard the horse coming up the line behind her, and did not stop walking. She had been walking since before dawn, when she had understood that the herd was not going to turn back no matter how many miles she put down, and that the only thing she could do for them was keep them off a run and let them follow until their owner came for them. Her feet hurt, her arm ached from the bag. She kept her voice going low and level, because 400 head on a public road stay calm only as long as somebody gives them a reason. Garrett came alongside and stepped down out of the saddle and walked beside her, leading the gelding, hat in his hand, and for 100 yards of that road he did not manage to say anything at all. Then he said it plain, because plain was the only currency she had ever dealt in, and he had finally learned the exchange. He said, "I judged a face, and I threw away the finest hand with stock I will ever see in my life, and there is no way to dress that up, so I will not try." He said, "My wife died 3 years back, and I have been so busy being afraid of what this town thinks of me that I let it cost you, and that is the sorriest thing a man can let his grief become." He said, "Every animal I own knew your worth in 1 hour of rain, and it took me 3 days and a torn-down fence, and I am ashamed of the difference." Sadie walked on a few steps. The herd came on behind them, patient as the tide. She said, "And what is it you are asking me, Garrett Vance?" He said, "I am asking you to come back to Rimrock, not on the notice's terms, on yours." He said, "Name them, and they are met. Partner in the stock, wages in your own name, the herd yours to manage as you see fit. And if there is ever anything more between us, it will be because you decided there ought to be, and not because a newspaper notice said so." He said, "And if you would rather walk on to the next town, I will drive these cattle home somehow, and not trouble you again. But I did not want the rest of my life to know I let you go twice." They walked on a moment more, the two of them and the 400, and the market crowd along the fences watching a courtship conducted at the head of a herd, which is, when you think about it, the only fitting place this particular courtship could have happened. Then Sadie Larkin stopped in the middle of the stage road and set down her carpet bag and turned around. 400 head of cattle rippled to a stop behind her, a mile of them, the halt running back down the column like wind over grass. She stood a moment looking at them, all those horned heads swinging up, every dark eye turning to the plain woman in the dusty dress. Whatever passed between her and that herd in the quiet was not for the crowd, and not for Garrett, and not entirely for the telling. She spoke one low word. Nobody who was on the road that morning ever agreed afterward on what the word was. Della Rennick swore to her dying day it was home, and Della Rennick told the story more often than anyone, so home is what the town settled on. Whatever it was, the old brindle steer swung his head and turned and started south, and the column turned behind him, animal by animal, a mile of cattle reversing on a public road as smooth as a rope running through a ring, and Sadie Larkin picked up her carpet bag and walked south through the middle of her herd toward Rimrock, and the herd fell in behind her, and Garrett Vance walked at her side, leading his horse, back down the road they had all come up, past the silent wagons, past Levi Sutton sitting his horse with his hat held over his heart like a man at church, past Della Rennick standing in her buggy, and as Sadie passed, Della found her voice at last, and what she said, loud enough for the whole road to hear, was not scorn. She said, "In 40 years in this country I have never seen the like of that woman, and Cutbank Crossing had better learn her name." It was the closest thing to an apology Della Rennick ever gave anybody, and everyone on the road knew it, and it went into the ledger of the town standing on the credit side, where it stayed. Word of what was coming ran ahead of them into Cutbank Crossing, and no buyer in the territory was fool enough to call that sale on time with the Vance herd still walking in behind a story like that, so the sale was held over to the afternoon. The herd came down the market road in the early afternoon, 400 head walking quiet behind a woman on foot, and the buyers stood up on the loading platform to watch it come, and the tale was all over the territory by Sunday. The beef steers Garrett had promised went through the scale pens calm as deacons and sold at the top of the market, because there is nothing a buyer loves like stock that arrives settled, and the mother cows and the calves and the old brindle that no money would ever buy off that ranch turned for home behind Sadie, and the buyer's ledger and his wife's agreed for once top to bottom on the worth of what had come down that road. The seasons at Rimrock turned the way seasons do, and the ranch changed the way a house changes when the right person is in it, which is to say slowly and then completely. Sadie ran the stock, and the stock prospered, and that is a plain sentence for a large truth. The herd that had been half wild gentled down year over year, because gentleness, it turns out, is a thing cattle learn the same way people do, from being given reasons. Levi Sutton became her best hand and her fiercest defender, and would fight any man in any bunkhouse in the territory who spoke slight of her, though he never once managed to say to her face what he thought of her, and she never once needed him to. Amos Teague stayed on to a great age, and said often, with satisfaction, that the best day's work he ever did on that ranch was setting one notice in one newspaper, and the second best was grabbing one man's arm in the rain and saying, "Wait," and Garrett kept his word to the letter. Her terms met and honoured. What grew between the two of them after that grew the slow way, the way she trusted, through seasons of work done side by side, through 100 small kindnesses that asked nothing back. Through the evening he finally walked her out to the cottonwood and introduced her, in a halting voice, to Eleanor, and she stood with him there and said that a woman so loved must have been worth loving, and that she did not aim to take a place that was filled, only the empty one beside it. They married in the fall of the second year, in the churchyard at Cutbank Crossing, and half the county came, and Della Rennick sat in the second pew and cried, and denied it afterward. But the picture the town kept, the one that outlasted all of them and got told to grandchildren on winter porches for 50 years, was not the wedding. It was a dusk at Rimrock, early on, the evening of the day the herd came home. Sadie stood alone at the big trough with the light going red on the Rimrock ledge above her, and the cattle came to water easy and unafraid, crowding gently around her the way they never did for any other living soul, and she stood among them with her hand resting on the neck of the old brindle steer, in her plain dress, in her plain face, in the middle of everything that had walked away from a rich man's ranch to follow her down a public road. She thought, standing there, about all the rooms that had measured her and sent her away, and about the aunt who had told her that useful was all she would ever be. Her aunt had been wrong about nearly everything, but wrongest about that word. Because a place is not given to a woman, Sadie had learned, not by a notice in a paper, not by a man's approval, not by a pretty face. A place is earned and built and stood upon until it knows your weight, and no one who has earned her ground that way can ever be put on a stage and sent off it again. The cattle drank. The light went down soft over Wyoming, and Sadie Larkin, who had been judged too plain to keep, latched the gate on the richest and gentlest herd in the territory, and walked up through the blue evening to the lit windows of the house, and went in, and was home.